so much for inviting me to help to honor Angelo in this way. I'm absolutely delighted. It's a wonderful thing that he's being given this legacy award, because of course this is something that he absolutely deserves, having shared his passion for opera and singing with so many of us over the years. Angelo, we've just heard you singing. We've seen photographs of you as a young child. We know your work as a professor and a teacher and a prolific and imaginative opera director. What brought you to want to share this passion of opera?
Well, let's go back to the beginning. I was born in 1943 in the city of Milan in Italy. And it was a very noisy birth because the Allied bombing was going on. In fact, although the famous Duomo with the Madonnina was saved, La Scala wasn't. And it all had to be reconstructed after the war. My parents were both very musical. They weren't professional in any kind of way. My dad worked at Isotta Fraschini as a technical engineer, but he did play drum kit with friends of his in a jazz band. He also played the piano, accordion, and the mandolin. So he was a man for all seasons, as it were. My mother had a very strong, well-tuned contralto voice. And she was an embroiderer, and she sat at a table with young ladies, and they all sang the popular songs of the day. And of course, the popular music at that time was sung in Italy, very much like opera was sung. We mustn't forget that the famous opera singers of the day, people like Beniamino Gigli and Tito Schipa, for example, all made very good extra money by recording popular songs as well as popular opera arias, and they were broadcast on a regular basis. So I seem to have been born with this kind of operatic sound in my ears. And I don't quite remember when it was that I tried to imitate the sound, but apparently I was something like 3 years old, and I started singing along with the recordings, and my passion for opera was definitely born then. The passion continued on the musical side, on the vocal side. On the other hand, my mother's family, my paternal grandfather was a great entertainer. Unfortunately, he died before I could meet him, but he did lots of mixtures of Milanese songs and played the fool with acting Il Shur Pastissa, which was a very famous Milanese sort of comedy sketch. So my performing genes came from the maternal side of the family, while the musical operatic genes seem to have come from my paternal side of the family. Anyhow, after the war, the family moved to South Africa, and we lived in Bellville, right next door to the Fatisamoni macaroni factory, because my dad had come to set up some pasta machinery for the Fatisamoni. And I used to sing at many Italian gatherings, Italian picnics, Italian community festivals. And whenever I was around, Dad played the piano accordion, Mother started singing, and we sang lots of choruses, but then people wanted to hear me sing solo. And I was not averse to that at all. As well as being passionate about singing, being Cancerian, I was also passionate about water and the sea. And in Italy, I used to very frequently go with the family to Loano and to Liguria and bathe in the very warm waters of the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, the Atlantic in South Africa, and particularly the Atlantic around the Cape Town areas of Clifton, Camps Bay, and so on, is not conducive to a young Italian boy getting his toes wet. I thought the water was absolutely freezing, and I hesitated to get into the water. And my dad found that there was warmed water at the Sea Point Pavilion. Well, it wasn't quite as warm in the Mediterranean, but it was passable. And so I used to frequently accompany my dad to the pavilion. And at the pavilion, there was entertainment. And part of the entertainment was a wonderful entertainment by a great humorous man called Vic Davis. He had a band which played in a conch-like cement shell, and his band used to accompany children, which Vic Davis cajoled into coming up on stage and playing some acts. And then my dad said, well, you keep on singing everywhere, why don't you go up and sing? I wasn't averse to the idea, and I went up onto the stage. The only problem was that when I asked Vic Davis if his band could play Che Geli da Manina or La Donna Immobile or Lucian le Stelle, they all looked at me blankly and said, but you know, this is opera, we haven't got the scores for that, and we don't quite know how to improvise that. Well, at the time, which was around 1951, so I was 8 or 9 years old, I had seen in Belleville a film which was very influential to my whole life. And this was The Great Caruso, featuring a wonderful Italian tenor called Mario Lanza. He was actually born in America and an American lorry driver, but he had a superb voice. The career lasted for all too short a time, but when I heard him sing, because you come to me with naught save love, and all those popular songs, well, Vic Davis's band knew those songs, and so I started performing them. It turned out that Vic Davis was so impressed that he approached my father and asked permission to engage me to sing at the concerts he performed on Sunday afternoons, early evenings at the Musenberg Pavilion. And so Angelo and his mom used to get onto the train, which in those days was very safe and very punctual. And from Belleville, we'd travel through to Salt River and change trains and get to Musenberg and walk to the pavilion. And there I sang all sorts of semi-operatic songs and got my first professional checks for them. And I enjoyed that very much until my voice, of course, developed like all boys' voices do, and it started breaking. I want to stress at this stage that the Italian way children sing is not quite the same way as the Vienna boys sing or the English choirs sing. We don't particularly fancy the kind of falsetto, treble, gentle singing of Silent Night or something like that. We like to make the kind of noise that opera singers make. And when it was not possible for me to do that, I didn't want to give up the performing. And I was very fortunate that I approached my headmaster. I went to high school at St. Joseph's College, which are the Marist brothers in Rondebosch. And I approached the headmaster, Brother Odelo, and said, would you permit me to put on a play? And he says, well, if you can persuade any of your schoolmates to act in it for you. And I did. I always seem to have facility in persuading people to do what I wanted them to do. Well, there it is.
It's a talent.
And I used to then choose the play and design the sets and the costumes, put all the props together and direct it. And I remember we played Dear Delinquent, for example, and the affected young ladies on the Marist Brothers stage. And I was also fortunate in that Padre Malletto, an Italian Consolata Fathers priest, wanted to keep the Italian youth together, and he asked me to direct a few plays in Italian for the Italian community. So while my voice was settling down into becoming whatever it would become later, I had a lot of experience actually directing plays, the technical side of stagecraft and so on. And part of all this led me to meet a wonderful lady, Albina Bini, who was very frequently a guest at the Friends of Italy. And she had heard of my reputation, and she had heard that I sang. And she said, well, I think I could help you. And help me she did. She was extraordinarily generous. She invited me to her beautiful home, La Grotta in Rondebosch, a wonderful villa designed in Tuscan style with a splendid garden. Unfortunately, it's all gone now. But it was very beautiful at the time. And she was so generous, she never charged me for a single lesson. And I really owe her the professional opportunities that she created for me. She gave me singing technique, but she expanded my view of singing. It wasn't only opera that she trained me in. She also introduced me to oratorio singing. She introduced me to lieder singing. She introduced me to French chanson, Baroque, early Baroque songs, and so on. And so my very first professional debut as the new voice, which was a bass, was when she introduced me to Bob Selly, Robert Selly, who was musical director of the Port Elizabeth Oratorio Festival. And in 1964, I made my debut in Port Elizabeth at the great Feather Market Hall in Judas Maccabeus and, of course, the Messiah. And the Messiah, I could have made a living on just singing the Messiah all over the country. In Cape Town, I sang many, many Messiahs. I had the privilege of singing the Messiah with Dr. Patrick Wise,
yes,
who happened to have given birth to the beautiful Vetta Wise, who's interviewing me now. And he organized the music at the Metropolitan Church in Cape Town. And singing for him was a great pleasure and a privilege. We also sang with Barry Smith and the St. George's Singers. We sang with the Philharmonia Choir, and I went to Peter Maritzburg, I went to Bloemfontein, I went all over the show, and I was really quite a successful singer. But my first real operatic success was when Miss Beanie introduced me to the wonderful Louis Stein. And Louis Stein had just been appointed as artistic director of the newly formed CAPAB Opera. And here, I suppose, we must pause for a moment and think of the not quite so pleasant side of South African art and politics. Many singers, many performers felt that to make a professional living, they had to go overseas, and they wanted to be able to work in their home country. And so the politicians in charge at the time decided that they would form system which they based on the English system of the arts councils, and they formed 4 performing arts councils. In that time, there were 4 provinces. South Africa was divided into the Cape Province, the Transvaal, Natal, and the Orange Free State. So there were 4 performing arts councils, and the Cape Performing Arts Councils was called CAPAB, Cape Performing Arts Board. The only problem was that, of course, politicians were all white, and the opportunities for performance were given to the privileged white citizens of the country. And no consideration at all was made to provide opportunities for any of the actors and singers and musicians of the other South African races to perform for the arts boards or the arts councils. I had the privilege in the early 50s of hearing a group of singers perform at the City Hall under 2 great Italians, Gregorio Fasconaro, who directed operas, and Joe Manca, who conducted them. And Joe Manca had, they were both prisoners of war who decided to stay on in South Africa after the war, and they both married South African ladies. And Joe Manca had married what, for lack of a better term, is always called a Cape colored lady, and lived in District 6 with her. And friends used to call, and they used to make music together, and gardeners and domestics, bakers, plumbers, painters used to come around, and he introduced them to opera. And they put on fully staged productions of opera at the City Hall, because the venue permitted the non-white audience to sit upstairs and the white audience to sit downstairs. So they saw the same performance, but they weren't sitting together. A bit of coronavirus activity even before the time. And they called themselves the Owen Group. And I was absolutely blown over by the quality of these voices and the kind of professionalism and dedication that these people brought to Italian opera. And somewhere or other in my young mind, I calculated that the percentage of Cape Coloreds in the country must be relatively small. It was a fair percentage, about 80% of the Cape Town population, but in the whole country, the majority of the population was Black. And I said, if only Black people wanted to sing opera, if only we could waken the passion for Black singers to come and sing, what kind of voices would happen then? And it was a great fortune that as my career developed, I got the opportunity of doing just that. Yes. At first, I established myself as a singer. I very soon became a singer-director, and quite soon after that, I became a director and decided to abandon the singing because it proved too taxing for me to appear in productions in which I used to sing the leading role while I had to direct the whole show, and my voice wasn't particularly fresh on the opening night. And CAPAB offered me the job of being a resident opera producer. It was called in those days. These days it would be opera director. And as well as doing opera, I was privileged in having the opportunity of doing many operettas. Fledermaus, I have directed in tutte le salse, as they say in Italy. I did the first Fledermaus that was on New Year's Eve at the famous Nico Malan when it was opened. Yes. And of course it was opened to great fanfare. and to great boycotts because the powers that be had decided that the Nico Malan was going to be for whites only. So white people could come and sit in its hallowed seats, and white people could sing on the stage, and a lot of people resented that. And I think there are probably still quite a number of people who have never set foot into the Nico Malan, although it's now called Artscape, and everything has changed in the country. But that memory is a very bitter one, and it was a very difficult pill to swallow. Anyhow, I made a debut producing musicals, doing Showboat in Port Elizabeth, of all places. I was very popular in Port Elizabeth. And then I was asked to do South Pacific at the Nico Malan with the great Lawrence Foley singing the leading role of Emile de Beck. Wonderful man, Lawrence Foley, had tall, handsome, with the most glorious voice. He could sing anything, and he'd been trained in England by the Sadler's Wells Company and knew that speech was as important as singing, and he could project every word towards the back of the auditorium. I learned so much from him, and it was a great joy to have him as one of my great colleagues.
Yes.
My first opera debut was at the Alhambra Theatre, where CAPAB opened before the Nico Malan was built. And there I sang as a low bass the role of Kecal in The Bartered Bride. And I hope I'm not taking too much of your time when I say that Louis Stein's idea of how the arts councils should benefit the population of South Africa was very different to the way Leo Quayle saw things up in Pact and Johannesburg and Pretoria. While Johannesburg and Pretoria felt that opera was grand and they wanted grand singers from overseas to come out and do all the popular operas, Louis Stein explained to me that he felt that the general public was very familiar with the popular operas as sung by very famous singers on recordings. After all, who didn't know Tebaldi's Tosca and La Bohème? Who didn't know Callas's La Traviata and all her Lucia recordings and so on, Dal Monaco di Stefano? And if one mounted these popular operas, the public would come with the sound of these famous international singers firmly in their ears, and perhaps be disappointed that South African singers weren't quite up to that standard. So he decided to do operas like The Bartered Bride and Marta, and operas which weren't so well known that people knew all the famous tunes already, so that if South African singers performed, they would be judged on the merits of that individual performance. And what's more, if some singers had to be imported from overseas, they were imported at the last moment, saving hotel and time. And South African singers were used for rehearsals and given the opportunity to perform. And that's why I was given the opportunity to perform the huge role of Kecal when I was barely 21 years old.
And Angelo, that was actually a wonderful time for those of us who were just that little bit younger, because we had the opportunity to go to these operas. I was, as a child, I was actually in the chorus as well. But there were all of these things, the Yoan group and the things that you were in. But what was also fantastic were the people that you were performing with at this point. Because they, you know, these collaborations, these are all names that influence. I know there's some people watching today that will remember this time as well. And it was seminal for us.
Sort of
very much.
Incredible people. I mean, you know, Nelly du Toit, I think, was Louis Stein's favorite soprano. And he gave her many opportunities in Cape Town,
Yes.
which nearly rose to every occasion.
The Lucia, for example, that was
well,
nice.
the Bartered Bride was sung by
Yes,
Nelly.
also.
Not my performance. Celine Koch did the performance in which I sang, but I was asked by NAPAC, the Durban people who would come to the performance, whether I would be prepared to go to Durban and sing the Bartered Bride. And of course, I was really keen to do that. And I went to Durban, and there was Nelly, and I sang with her in Durban. And she was busy giving coaching to Hay Corsten. So we met people like Hay Corsten, Evelyn Dahlberg, Virginia Wursthuizen, all these people who became such close friends. Joyce Barker, with that huge voice of hers, unfortunately matched by a rather large scale physique, but what a wonderful performance she could deliver. Mm-hmm. And all these performances really marked my life. And we did so much touring in abbreviated versions of the operas, which we called Opera for All. And we went out throughout the province, and we made a very good living, quite frankly, because what with the opera season in town, the touring operas, the oratorios and the leader concerts and so on, I managed to settle down very well and could buy property and could save money. And I could forget about the fact that I'd actually been trained as a scientist, because to keep my parents happy, I went to the university and studied chemistry and physics, that sort of thing. But by the time I'd got to my honors, we all decided that I knew what I wanted to do. And I went on to fulfill my great passion for opera. The change to giving up the singing and becoming a director came at a fair cost, because I was expected to do all the productions that the CAPAB administration, directive administration wanted me to do. And it was very hard work. And there I had the privilege of traveling overseas to experience artists, to see opera houses, to find out how they managed to mount productions. And I had a wonderful experience going to Berlin in the days when East Berlin and West Berlin were still two very different places. And I went particularly to hear the great Marita Napier, who was singing in Tannhäuser in West Berlin. And we got on famously together, and I wanted to talk to her to see whether she was prepared to do some of the things that I expected singers to do in my productions, not always wanting to be traditional about it. And she said, well, I can sing in any position. You can get me lying down, you can get me on my stomach, I'll come in and sing for you. And we did the production of La Forza del Destino, and she sang superbly. The rest of the cast was excellent. There were several imports, and I won my second Nederburg Prize for that particular production. And so I gave up, shall we say, my Mozart. My first Nederburg Prize was for singing Papageno in Die Toverfluit, a performance of the Magic Flute in Afrikaans. And my first touring production was Così fan tutte, with a wonderful cast, which we did over 50 performances of throughout the country. And well, it was a great privilege in that I met wonderful artists like Aviva Pelham, and I managed to persuade her in the first production we did together, Don Pasquale, that she would make her appearance singing a very difficult first aria in a bubble bath.
I will never forget. I will never. That was a memory that is completely.
And,
I was gobsmacked. We were all. You got your audience. There she was.
We had such fun. We had such fun. And Aviva's remained a great friend, and we were planning to do all sorts of things for our 50th wedding anniversary. Don Pasquale was our first wedding on stage, although it was a mock wedding. But it was 50 years ago, and we were hoping to do 50 years of golden memories. But the virus has stood in its way. Perhaps it will come. It will come. And then, of course, came a huge change in my life. The change was brought about by several happenings. The arts councils were being severely criticized for spending so much money on putting on operas and art for the select few. And opera was funded according to a very special Stoop formula. I don't want to go into that, it's too silly for words, but that was the way it was done. And the drama companies and so on were losing work, and they were losing possible actors, and a lot of resentment started being built up against opera. And it became rather difficult to find the right money to put on opera. And so CAPAB decided that they were going to import Murray Dickey, a very experienced operatic performer and director from Vienna, and he came to Cape Town and established a very strong company, importing some friends from overseas. He handled the orchestra as well, and he introduced Cape Town audiences to very many Wagnerian performances. He did Tristan and Isolde, he did the Meistersinger for Nuremberg. Expensive shows. It was wonderful to be able to admire those works, but audiences were not particularly keen on going to operas like that. And so when he arrived, I decided that it was time to try and employ the other side of my talent. While at the university doing my honors diploma, I had been asked to coach some students and give some classes. And the classes worked very well. Everybody listened to me with rapt attention, and I was appointed as assistant lecturer by the university. So it was quite clear that not only I was gifted in performance, but perhaps I was also gifted in training and teaching.
Indeed,
so,
Angela, and that was absolutely your gift for inspiring young people, which led to your fantastic influence at UCT. And did you find that that, combined with being head of operatic studies, was able to continue to fulfill your vision? Because that we really want to hear about.
That was the key. That was the key issue. When in 1982, Brian Priestman, who was the director of the College of Music, approached me because Gregorio Fesconaro, who'd been the head of the opera school for many years, had retired. He came to me and said, you know, we don't want the opera school to close down because Gregorio has left, and we'd like to appoint you as head of operatic studies. I accepted the challenge. Of course, I hadn't trained as a musician. I trained as a scientist. So in my first couple of years, it was a bit of an experiment as to how I should be training opera singers. And in Cape Town, we have had a particular way of training people in opera, which is very different from all the places I've been to overseas, in English, American, Italian colleges, and so on. Opera is taught by people who've already finished a singing diploma. They are capable of singing opera. They have proved that they've got the voice. They have all the technique that's required, and then they are put onto the opera stage and get taught the stage craft and the lasting power that opera demands.
Yes, it's a postgraduate course, definitely. And so you were though having to deal with the students, weren't you? I
had to deal with people who were admitted to an opera course when they hadn't sung anything in their lives before. And you had to work out exams and a way of putting on productions for them and marking them, although they would probably develop, and many of them developed into fine singers. For the first 3 or 4 years, they simply had to study singing. So it was quite a challenge in those first years to work out the kind of program that would allow young people who hadn't got a fully developed voice yet to perform. And I did that by making some odd choices. I got on very well with Mavis Taylor, who was the acting director of the drama school, and I decided to do The Beggar's Opera. The Beggar's Opera has a lot of dialogue. The tunes are very straightforward, rather simple, and it's a huge cast. It's got lots of beggars, lots of choruses, and so on. And she permitted me to come to the drama school and to have auditions. And very many of the drama students decided that this was going to be fun and they were going to come and enjoy themselves. And there I had the privilege of meeting a young man called Dennis.
David Dennis.
And David surprised me by opening his mouth and singing with the far better voice than I'd heard from any of the students at the opera school.
Yeah.
And
these were fantastic days, Angelo, absolutely fantastic. I think also what people would love to hear is how this evolved into your absolutely incredible work that you did as you moved on from there as well.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, it took a bit of time.
Yes,
it took
indeed.
a bit of time. Things eventually changed at the opera school. We had new singing teachers arriving, people like Sarita Stern, who proved to be an absolutely superb technician and singing teacher. And a lot of young people like Marisa Vitali and Stephen McFarlane and Lawrence Geen developed at the opera school. They went overseas and they were white students, although they were some black students that had come to the opera school. You needed a special permit for them to come to the opera school. And things at the opera school were going very well. When one day Kecal came to see me, he'd just been appointed as head of CAPAB as the general director. And he said, Maridik is retiring. We want you to come and be director of CAPAB Opera. And it was possible for me to remain at the opera school and be head of the opera school, as well as being director of Cape Town Opera. And it was this fortunate coincidence of having a ruling power, shall we say, in both organizations, where it was possible to organize schemes for the development of young artists in the way that I had possibly imagined in my early youth. But the big change that made all this possible was, of course, and it's his day today, the release of Mandela from Robben Island. And when Mandela was released, suddenly the gates opened. And for many years at CAPAB and at the Opera School, we had wanted to try and get the involvement of young Black singers. We tried to go to Black schools with performances of opera, but it was quite dangerous and difficult to do that. And then I had the good fortune of hearing that because Dr. Patrick Wise had been taken seriously ill, his daughter Vetta Wise had decided to stop being a chorus member for PACT and come to Cape Town and teach at Rondebosch Boys High. But she had also decided to do a master's investigating the singing of Western music, particularly religious music, in the community choirs. And there was a contact, and I immediately approached Vetta, and it didn't take long to persuade her that this would be a wonderful contact to have. And we managed to persuade choirs to come and sing in operas. I will
yes,
never
indeed.
forget.
I think choirs were the key, were they not? I mean, I was working
Choirs,
with choirs. It wasn't
choirs.
the schools as much, but the choirs were the key because people loved to sing. They sang in this particular way, but it was just a question of introducing the opportunities.
Introducing the opera, because the
opera,
oratorios
yes.
and the sacred music, they were more accustomed to. But when it came to opera, they just had no experience of the kind of music that was involved. And so one of my best experiences was at the Rossini Festival. We did a concert version of William Tell.
Yes.
And when it came to the second act of William Tell, with the oath-taking ceremony, when all the cantons in Switzerland join, and it's the men's choirs from all the cantons in Switzerland swear to get rid of the oppressor. How many community choirs were on stage?
Oh, there were at least five.
Like
there were at least five, but they were everything from Fishhook to Guguletu. I mean, it was literally, you know,
a sound
learnt in different
Cape Town
ways.
audiences had never heard before. It was so, so special. And the dear Lord was watching, and he was helping. He was helping through the individual interest, not only of the choirs, but of individual singers who came to me as head of the college and wanted to be trained in the singing of opera. So, for example, we had Abel Motsawadi, now Abel Moeng, who came to me, and he had an English teacher, and he arrived and sang Leporello's Letter aria to the manor born. I said to him, how many years have you been singing? Oh, he says, I've done a bit of singing in the choir, but otherwise I've never sung opera before. So I said, well, you must come to the opera school. This was immediately followed a few days later by a young man called Fikile Vigelva coming to sing. And he sang Di Provenza for me. And I sort of looked around and, you know, checked to see if all the ornaments were still entire in the room, because it was so loud. And that voice was so fully developed already. Fikile has, of course, developed into singing at the Metropolitan in Berlin, all over the world. And what a wonderful, wonderful man he was, wonderful performer. But we also had people like Marcus de Sando, who was very interested in joining. And although his voice wasn't of the magnitude either of Abel or Fikile, he had a wonderful acting skill. And I felt that he could become a wonderful comprimario singer and possibly a director. And director he did become, and he's at the moment the CEO of the Arts and Culture Trust, and was instrumental in getting me my first award for this year, which is a wonderful award from the Arts and Culture Trust.
Oh, beautiful.
Very
that is beautiful. Yes,
lovely.
he played fast and loose between having to be at chorus rehearsals, which is part of his contract early on, but also having to be at the college. So
Yes,
he learnt about
yes,
that
yes.
kind of thing right from the beginning, I think.
But then he had the guts to say, I want to make a career for myself. I want to experience how things work overseas. And he went off and he joined an American company and became a specialist in porgy and bass. So when we eventually got the rights to play a porgy and bass, he knew many of the people that we could approach who were specialists in porgy and bass, because Sport and Life was one of his great roles. And of the ladies, we had Sibongile Ngoma,
yes,
who came, she'd already studied drama, and she wanted to round off her musical knowledge, but the voice was already wonderfully developed. And very early on, she sang a most exquisite countess in The Marriage of Figaro. And for a girl of her age, at such an early stage of development, to sing such a demanding role as the countess in international company was absolutely amazing. And Arnold Bosman, the conductor that conducted that performance, got her to go overseas with him, and he introduced her to European houses because he was so impressed. And the way we did this was, very fortunately, by finding funding from the Mellon Fund in America, and Stuart Saunders, the ex-Vice-Chancellor of the university, had given me instructions and helped me write an application. And the Mellon Fund helped students to form what was called the studio company. And it became known as the Cape Town Opera Studio and the UCT Opera Studio, and the two of them combined. And students were given bursaries so that they could live. Their accommodation was catered for, and they had to fulfill certain duties, which was to sing solo roles in all the operas. But probably the most important legacy we leave behind is that of the choral training program. And again, I owe to Vetta so much work and so much enthusiasm into building this group of singers. Because when these few singers came, and we didn't have money to do more than appoint 8 singers in the studio, eventually we managed to get some extra funds and we got up to 10 singers in the opera studio. We said, but what kind of voices must there be outside of this? And so, being still the old Cape province, we went to Port Elizabeth, we went to King Williamstown, we went to East London, we went to Queenstown, and we found the most incredible voices. Yes. Young people that had barely left school, some people that hadn't even passed a standard 8, as it was in those days, exams.
Absolutely.
But the kind of sound they made was unbelievable. And so we formed a funding for this group, and we called it the Choral Training Program. And people could come to Cape Town. We covered them with a bursary that covered their accommodation and their food costs, and they had to sing in the choruses of all the opera productions, and they could get classes in diction, in music, in voice production. And
And also in Western notation, Angelo, do you remember
Western
the
notation,
first Turandot?
absolutely.
I have to tell this story just very quickly because it was
Please
on my very
do.
first rehearsal with them. And I was teaching them a very easy unison thing from Turandot. Da, 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 dee, da, da. It took me about 2 hours because it was a question of geography, because they were used to not staff notation, tonic solfa. And so on. It took me ages. So I went to see Angelo straight after in his office and said, look, Angelo, I know you want to involve the CTP in the whole of Turandot, but could you possibly just include them in one act or something, or one scene? I'm never going to get them trained, you know, at this rate. And Angelo said, all or nothing. So of course it was all, and look, the learning process then sped up. But if it hadn't been for Angelo's, you know, urging and vision and belief and trust and just experience and knowing that.
Well, I knew I had a wonderful chorus master,
and
and
the
I
whip.
trusted also in the keenness and the dedication of these young people.
Yes.
You know, things have changed. Teaching is not quite the same as it used to be, because these young singers arrived in Cape Town, and all you saw them was walking around with headphones on and with cassette playing, and all day they were learning new pieces, new operas, new
Yes.
languages, new styles of movement, new grammatic devices. They had to learn Italian, they had to learn French, they had to learn German, they had to learn operatic repertoire. You know, it was incredible what could have been achieved and what was achieved in those
Yes.
days. And it was a huge privilege for me to be able to have such affection shown to me by so many of these wonderful individuals who still remember me, who still write to me on Facebook wishing me happy birthdays and sharing happy memories of things that we managed to do together. Things have changed. The choral training program became the Cape Town Opera Vocal Ensemble. There again, politics came into the situation. The CAPAB permanent chorus that had eventually been formed with the inclusion of Black and colored members had to be jettisoned. There wasn't enough money to pay full fees. And so because of Black empowerment, we could get funding for a group of Black people where it was not possible. And this led to a certain amount of resentment, people saying, well, we've been working for 20 odd years, we're experienced, and now there's no work for us, but people who've just come down the line and they have barely started singing lessons and they have got a permanent job. Well, it wasn't a permanent job, it was a 2-year contract.
Yes, it was an apprenticeship in effect.
Sometimes it was extended and sometimes not. So it was much easier to handle the company economically. But I felt under great pressure and decided that much as I enjoyed the singing, the teaching, and all the vision, going around and asking politicians for money was not quite my task. So I took early retirement from Cape Town Opera, and at the age of 60, they put on a wonderful concert called Bravo Angelo for me, and I left in a blaze of glory, as it were, and remained head of the opera school and retired from the opera school at the age of 65.
Now,
and
Angelo,
Michael Williams took over funding Cape Town Opera.
Yes.
But even then, you know, things have changed, and Michael Williams has had to leave, and the present funding director of Cape Town Opera, Elise Brunel, has been forced to abandon her task and go and live in America. So it's difficult to see where this legacy is going to find a future. And
But
all I can
Angelo,
say is the future must be found in the people themselves.
Yes, indeed. But what gives me hope, to end on a hopeful and an appreciative note, is the number of people to whom you have been an influence, and the people who are singing on the UK stage and on the American stage and so on, that are passing on this love and this passion. Where do you see your legacy as having been now, and where are you going from here? Just to end off with.
Vetta, history seems to be a wheel that turns and never learns. You know, I began my career because there were many South African opera singers who could build wonderful careers for themselves overseas. People like the great Mimi Kutsa, Emerentia Schiepers, Marita Napier, Carla Paul. They were all capable of singing internationally and built great careers for themselves. But they couldn't sing at home. There was no work for them. And so the powers that be at the time created the arts councils. And this created the possibility of work for South African opera singers and other artists. Unfortunately, the politics of the time meant that certain people were more advantaged than others. Now the politics has changed. So you'd swear that if the wheel is turned, the powers that be would have learned that now is the time to start a national opera, to rebuild the arts councils, and to provide work when there are so many unemployed people out there, and this virus is creating the most dreadful misery and unhappiness and violence, to simply survive and find some way of making a living, when there are so many talented and gifted people who could be paid very small fees simply to fulfill their passions, to put into practice what they can do, what Mother Nature has given them to do. Wonderful, wonderful voices, and make music together. Unfortunately, if they want to do this, they've got to go overseas. So we're back at the beginning. And so we've got Pretty Yende, who has just written to me from Milan. She's managed to get out of the country despite the virus, and she's traveled safely to Milano, and she's got several concerts coming up. One is going to be shown with Camarena on the Metropolitan series of concerts that's on in November. And she is going to Zurich to sing. But other people like Pumesa Machikiza, Sia Bulela Ntlale, Musa Nkwana. These are singers that are star singers used by great companies throughout the world. They've got audiences who can appreciate, and they all say, we wouldn't have been able to do this if it wasn't for the vision that somebody had to give us these opportunities.
Exactly. Angela, I'm going to interrupt because we have a message on our group chat from Marcus DeSando. And he says, if I may, thank you for sharing your love for this art form and for the growth of a number of us in different roles and responsibilities. I would not be here personally if it was not for your belief and vision of who we could be. And I think that summarizes the legacy that you have given to us. And hopefully, as they say, from your mouth to God's ear, that things can still happen. Your inspiration and your passion. Thank you for this, Angelo. Thank you.
I have confidence that the angels are listening to us. and may they help the angels on earth to continue singing. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Angelo.
And here is a passion for opera.
And here's one in the UK as well.
There you
well
are.
worth reading.
Bless you all. Bye-bye.
Hallelujah.